Hello, and welcome to the Soccernomics Podcast, the home of football economics. My name is George Lyons, and every Friday I'll be joined by special guests from all areas of the footballing world, along with our own team of expert journalists from the Soccernomics website, where we'll be delving into the economical, financial, business, and legal matters behind the beautiful game that we all love. If you're a fan of football and want to get to know more about what goes on behind the scenes of your club, or the impacts that football has on the economy and vice versa, continue listening and consider subscribing to us on YouTube and Spotify. If you're a football fanatic and weekly podcasts just aren't enough, head over to our website, soccernomics.net, where you can find more in-depth articles on all the latest topics in football economics, written by myself and our brilliant team of journalists. On this week's episode, I was joined once again by the brilliant Ammaar Karim, who is not only a member of the Soccernomics team, but he also is a member of the UN Youth, and he is actually a finance and computer science student at the University of Adelaide. Ammaar does write for us, he is a journalist, so you can read all of his work on our website, and I would definitely recommend doing that because they are brilliant pieces of work. He puts a lot of effort into it, so help him out, guys. And on the podcast, we actually discussed one of his articles, which is forward funding. Is it good or bad? Basically, it's exactly what it says on the tin. We were just discussing what forward funding is, why football clubs are using it more and more in the modern game, and why there are benefits to it. A lot of people think that it's a negative tool, but once you start understanding what forward funding is and the benefits it has to both the football club and the lender, you find that it's actually a very useful tool in football. So yeah, I hope you liked today's episode. If you did, end up hitting the like button. We'd really appreciate the support. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. All right, let's get into it. What's up, guys? George Lyons here. Welcome back to the Soccernomics Podcast. And today I'm joined once again by Ammaar Abdul Karim.
Hey, how's it going?
Yeah, good, mate. How are you?
Going all right.
Yeah? What's been happening?
It's been busy with uni, and so exams are around the corner. And
Yes, they
that's
sure
just been
are.
keeping me busy.
Yeah.
And then I have like other stuff going on as well with work as well.
Yeah.
So with my UN Youth work.
That's right, yeah.
So that's also been keeping me busy. But
Brilliant.
it is fun to like get away from all that and come on this podcast
Yeah, definitely.
and talk about Soccernomics.
Hey, that's why
Yeah,
we're
man.
here. That's why you're here. And guys, if you haven't already, definitely subscribe to the Soccernomics channel. We're trying to grow to be the best that we can possibly be. And most of our listeners aren't already subscribed, so do it. Today, Ammaar, what are we going to be talking about? We're going to be talking about forward funding,
Yeah.
in football clubs. Well,
Yep.
football clubs
It
in
was,
particular.
yep. So it was my recent article, and it's a bit of a unique one, mostly because it's essentially not really talked about.
Yeah.
And many fans that just watch, football every day, it's not going to come across their mind about what goes on behind the scenes and how football clubs can essentially afford to do what they do and afford to operate and maintain the activities. And most importantly, how they really manage their cash flow with all these like massive wage bills going on every week and, stadium renovations. And so essentially this topic is really behind the scenes of what goes on and how they're able to maintain in terms of cash flow management and debt issues.
Yeah. It seems like a really interesting topic. Like, if you guys haven't read the article already, check it out on the Soccernomics.net website. It's a really, really good podcast, and it just basically dumbs it down so it's so easy to understand, because there is, let's be honest, when it comes to like anything to do with finances, when it comes to using debt to finance anything, there's such a stigma around it where people who don't quite understand it feel like using debt is such a bad way of using your finances, or it's such a risk. But that's not necessarily the case, is it?
Yep. So, I mean, generally, debt has had a bit of a bad publicity with football, especially. I mean, if we look at it, all the clubs that have gone, or majority of the clubs that have gone into administration, it's mostly due because of them essentially defaulting on their own loan and their lender taking over any assets that club owns, including the stadium and shares in the organization or whatnot.
Yeah.
And so obviously events like that really, I guess, put out negative press about using debt to raise capital.
Yeah. I mean, not like it's not that debt isn't a bad thing. Like debt is can definitely become a really bad thing, and if you don't manage your debt in the right way, it causes the worst things that can happen, which is a club having to liquidate.
Yep, 100%. And I think so times have changed, and debt has been extremely crucial into maintaining the cash flow of a club. And not just that, in signing players as well, it's been extremely crucial. And one example of this is a club so I could use one example of this is when a club buys a player, people would assume that all that money is actually paid upfront in one lump sum, when in fact it's actually paid in installments over probably a year or 2 years maybe. And debt is very instrumental in that process. And what it allows is allows a club to effectively manage its cash flow between periods where they've got wage bills rising and they haven't received that full money yet from the selling of a player. And so I think people, your everyday football fan, you wouldn't really. It's not something that has come across their mind.
100%.
And of course, there's always risk that comes with debt. But what we're going to talk about today is also talking about how utilizing debt has evolved into becoming less risky, and that's what forward funding is. It's essentially an evolution of how clubs have maintained their debt and how clubs have really changed from, I guess, being risk neutral to more risk averse, especially in this climate during COVID-19.
Right.
And I mean, compared to traditional lending, this is very different. Forward funding.
Well, let's kick off then with what is forward funding, and essentially how does that differ to your traditional lending?
So forward funding is also known as essentially in the finance sector it's known as a development finance agreement, and in the football world, or at least in terms of Soccernomics terms, it's known as forward funding. And essentially what that is the best way to think about it is it's an exchange between a club's future revenue and for cash up front. So what happens is that if a club wants to essentially manage their cash flow effectively, and they're in a downward spiral and they're facing cash flow crunches, what they would do is they would take out a loan from a lender, whether it be a commercial bank, private bank, any lender that provides a financing facility to football clubs, and that loan would be secured against their future revenue streams, which, if you think about it, 20 years ago, no clubs it wasn't the majority case for clubs. 10 years ago, the majority case of clubs was traditional lending.
That was just because there wasn't really the money in football, really, wasn't there?
100%.
20 years ago, football was nowhere near 100% the lucrative business that it is now. But now there's so many other ways of, but there's so much money in it. There's other ways of lending.
And I mean, so this really came about. Not really came about, but this really rose to spotlight in terms of public exposure and even the Premier League exposure, because they didn't even know what was going on until the sale of Reading FC to a Thai consortium. And so and not even the Premier League knew what was going on. Essentially what happened in that scenario was, so Reading FC was, they took out a loan from, I think, a corporation called Vibrac.
Yeah.
And essentially what happened was, that loan was different to traditional loans at that time, whereby it was secured against Reading FC's future revenue streams. So when I say future revenue streams, I'm talking about broadcaster revenue, revenue in installments as well from selling players. I'm also talking about parachute payments from regulation. So what parachute payments are is that they're essentially payments you get once you've regulated.
Relegated.
Relegated.
Regulated.
Relegated, all right?
No, that's cool.
I've
cool.
only,
Right.
basically,
It's
I
early.
only known the difference until now.
Really?
I thought regulated and relegated were the same thing.
It's an easy mistake to make.
Regulated and relegated.
Look at Braden's face.
Can you confirm this? Regulated
It's
and
alright.
relegated.
Let's go. Very different words. But hey,
Okay, you know what?
it's all right.
You're putting me
It's
on
all
the
right.
spot.
It's all right. I thought paradigm was peridium.
Yeah, that's terrible.
So I've got nothing to. That was only a year ago.
Oh, I love that.
Oh,
love
God.
that. Love that.
I must have made myself look a right fool.
What were we
Anyway,
talking
Karim.
about?
We were talking about parachute payments.
Right.
So what
yeah.
parachute payments are?
So like I was saying before, when a club gets relegated,
Yeah.
was that right?
Yeah.
So when a club gets relegated, they're guaranteed these payments from the Premier League, which are known as parachute payments. So these future revenue streams are guaranteed. So there's no situation or scenario where they're not entitled to them, unless the Premier League goes through a financial distress moment.
Yeah.
But almost in any case, they are guaranteed payments. And so what Reading FC did was that they got this loan, and what they agreed with the lender was that they secured the loan against these future revenue streams, which are guaranteed, right? There's no risk because the lender's going to get their money with interest as well, and Reading FC's going to get cash up front instead of waiting that long period to receive all that money.
Yeah, so they can like invest in
Exactly. It's
operations
just
there and
it's really optimal for cash flow management and in terms of club operations and whatnot. So what happened was that essentially Reading FC didn't manage to repay that loan. So even though they pledged their revenue streams upfront to Vibrak Corporation, they still didn't make the cut. And so what happened in that case was that corporation, the lender, took over Reading FC and its assets. So when I say assets, I'm talking about the club's shares and even
like the stadium.
yeah,
players.
yeah. So intangible assets like the stadium, rights, broadcaster rights, etc. And so that really, so that was out of the blue when Reading FC kind of announced that they're up for sale, essentially.
Right.
And so there was a lot of discussions about how did this occur.
Yeah,
Essentially,
that can't be good. Hey,
it can't be good, especially if nobody really saw it coming. And essentially, Premier League got involved, and I think the FA probably got involved as well. And essentially, what happened was that Reading FC, it came to spotlight that Reading FC took on a forward funding loan,
Right.
a loan that was essentially agreed on terms of forward funding or development finance agreement.
Yeah.
And so there have been some instances like the one I just talked about happening, especially with Watford FC.
Yeah.
And so regulation has also been beefed up in some way that you have to essentially let the Premier League know beforehand that you're going to take on this form of loan. And so I'll just talk a bit about what happened with Watford FC because it's a bit of an interesting one.
Yeah.
So this was literally a year after. So Reading FC situation happened in 2012.
When was it? I think you're right. Yeah.
2012,
yeah.
and the Watford scenario happened in 2013. And essentially, what happened was that Watford agreed the same terms, but with a different organisation lender called LNOC, and so those agreement those agreements were such that Watford FC's future revenue streams will be backed up for the loan. The loan will be secured against them.
Mm-hmm.
But in this case, Watford FC didn't default on the loan. But what they did wrong was that they didn't notify the Premier League of the fact that they are going to be taking on this loan.
Right.
And so
Naughty.
Yeah. And so essentially before that, so after the Reading FC occurred, the Premier League essentially said that you need to tell us about if you're going to be taking on this form of agreement, and we need to approve it or we can reject it if we see the risk is there of insolvency.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially what Watford FC did was they took on that loan and did not notify the Premier League. And
Fortunately,
yeah.
they didn't default on it, because
So-
that could have been very messy.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of, I guess, discussions about why Watford FC didn't approach the Premier League and lay down what their plans were with this loan.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, one of the major discussions is that it would have got rejected by the Premier League. You know, you can't take this loan because by our standards, it's too risky for a club of your size, and especially the assets as well.
Mm.
And so that again brought the forward funding into the spotlight, and again with negative press coverage and whatnot.
Understandably.
Yeah.
Especially if that's just straight after what happened with Reading. And yeah, like, again, there's such a stigma around debt, because we're led to believe that, hey, you can't be in debt because debt's a bad thing, because then all of a sudden you're lending money.
Yeah.
And your spending is more than what you're earning. Essentially, that's what they're saying. But obviously debt is a very valuable tool. Like, the biggest businesses in the world, even the government, like, is mainly financed with debt, right?
Yep, 100%.
What are the advantages, and do they outweigh the disadvantages of the potential disadvantages of forward funding? Because clearly clubs aren't doing it because it's extremely risky. There's obviously something in it for them.
Yep. So with utilizing debt to raise capital, I think it's very well for Premier League clubs. Like I was saying before, in terms of their cash flow, ins and outs.
Mm-hmm.
They have huge wage bills, and that's probably like the most in terms of like what comes out in terms of cash flow. And then you also have small other income, like I was saying before, in terms of installments, player signing fees, which they only get in installments. So, and I was also talking about it in the previous podcast where I go somewhat in depth into like what goes in and out in terms of revenue for and expenses for a typical Premier League club. But essentially, I think that debt is very crucial in almost all cases for a Premier League club. In saying that, that's because it's very optimal for cash flow management, and if it's if the terms are agreed in a very secure manner and in a manner that the loan is secured against, in this case, forward funding, the loan is against guaranteed future revenue streams, then it really brings benefits to both parties. In one case, in one side, you have the club which is benefiting from this in that they are receiving cash up front instead of waiting a long period to receive all these cash flows accumulated. And so in the other side, you have the lender, and it's very optimal for the lender in this situation because they are their loan is more secured than in compared to traditional lending, which in traditional lending, essentially what would happen is a lender will secure their loan against intangible assets of the club. Often it would be the stadium or properties of the club, and sometimes it will be shares in the club's organization. And that's also very risky. So if we look at traditional lending and the type of securitization, said that right?
Good job.
Securitization. So those loans are secured against often stadiums, and what the risk that faces is that it can face downward pressure in the property market. So
wow.
It will be secured against the stadium, and over time that stadium may depreciate in value, and that obviously brings a disadvantage to the lender, and so forward funding brings a lot of benefits for both the lender and the sporting organization. And I think nowadays it's being more popularly used, and that's mostly by Premier League clubs, and I think EFL clubs are slowly adjusting to it.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. So it basically, obviously, there would have been when it first started happening, especially happening, and it was having negative outcomes.
Yeah,
the clubs would have been less, what would you say, obliged to doing it.
Yeah,
like they wouldn't have been as open to doing it. But now that there's an actual strategy in place, there's an actual plan forward, and they can prove that they can make this work. Just making sure that they are getting the correct revenue streams that can satisfy those loans. There's no reason for them not to do it, because, like you said, the advantage for the club is they're getting capital up front, which can be allow them to do things that are like, time is so important for some clubs, and having that capital there and then might be so important. For example, when it comes to having to upgrade the stadium, and it's not cheap. Like upgrading a stadium,
100%.
How much was it for Tottenham Hotspur's stadium?
Oh,
like $100 million.
Go into it.
I think it was £1 billion.
It was amazing. It was crazy.
Yeah, crazy.
We talked about that in a previous podcast where, pardon me. Essentially, what happened was they used and this was just before, I guess, the COVID economics really impacted the Premier League, and they took out the loan, and obviously they were hit very hard. And even before the COVID economic impacts in the Premier League, they were already facing massive financial, disarray, and the COVID impact made it much worse, and they had to extend the lender's financing facility to the club.
Yeah, I remember you saying this in the podcast.
Yeah. And
if you guys haven't seen it, I'll put a link in the description. Should be like up here.
But then again, the question does arise that does taking on more loans or extending the loaning or lending facility, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But there's no right or wrong answer to this. I think it depends on the club and the club's assets as well, size of the club.
Mm-hmm.
But in what we're talking about right now, forward funding, I think it should merit consideration in terms of when a club is facing financial disarray. In terms of short-term funds, it should definitely merit consideration, 100%. And 100%.
Yeah.
That's all I gotta say, because there's nothing in terms of disadvantages to this,
except for the fact if you don't have secure revenue income, which then clearly your finance department is not doing their job properly if they can't figure that out before they take on this loan.
Yep. I mean, when you compare the disadvantages to the disadvantages of traditional lending, forward funding definitely outweighs traditional lending, in that it has more advantages and the disadvantages are less risky in that sense.
That's very interesting, because obviously we're led to believe that it's the opposite, or like when you look at it at a glance, it just seems so much more risky, but it's actually not, as long as you are on top of your finances and you can make sure that your revenue streams can satisfy that loan.
Yep.
Having capital up front is such a useful tool, because, like I said, it allows you to take on operations that you need to do there and then that you can't quite afford. As long 100%. As you can afford it down the line, hey, that's worth it. And forward funding is a great tool for that. So with that being said, of course, like we know what forward funding is. We know that it can be a very valuable tool. What's the future for forward funding in football, especially?
So as we know today, it is popularly used amongst, I guess, big clubs in Premier League, and it is being approached for consideration by smaller clubs that don't really have assets in larger size in comparison to obviously the larger clubs, and are therefore more at risk to insolvency. And so it's definitely something that will always merit consideration, and I think it's something that is going to be approached definitely more and more towards the future. And I can use one example of this, is that Macquarie Bank, which is, for those that are listening in and don't know what a Macquarie Bank is, so essentially they're a Australian investment banking firm, and surprisingly, unusually, they have a somewhat of a present dominance in providing financing facilities to sporting organisations in the UK. So it's very unusual for a bank of that financial institution to be providing that financing facility to UK sporting organisations.
I didn't even know that. Hey?
Yeah, and so what's also, like, I guess, surprising as well is that they provide forward funding agreements in terms of lending funds to sporting organisations. And so as we know right now, clubs that have really taken on these agreements include Leicester City, Wolves, Bournemouth, Crystal Palace, etc.
Wow, that's a lot. Big list.
Yeah, exactly. And so they're exposed to essentially this game, this new presence of development finance agreements is pretty dominant at the moment, and that just tells me that obviously this is an approach that many clubs in Europe as well, so in Germany, Barcelona as well, are approaching this form of debt agreement, debt lending agreement with a lender, and it's always going to merit consideration 100%.
Perfect. So what you're saying is you expect to see this happening more and more and more, and more clubs get involved in this.
Well, so in today's climate, and I think over what's been the trend in the past few years, is essentially traditional lenders. So when I say traditional lenders, I'm talking about in the UK. I'm talking about Barclays, NatWest Bank, your kind of big banks that are the go-to for lending. They have kind of backed off from lending funds to sporting organizations, and that's primarily because they don't have the resources and the expertise to really place a value on a sporting organization's intangible assets, and so it's really hard for them to, I guess, place a value on a player, because players aren't really seen as assets in the financial world when you talk about, Barclays Bank.
Yeah.
And also, broadcast rights and broadcast agreements, they're very hard to evaluate for, and they're pretty risky as well to take on as a dominant lending bank in the UK. And so what has actually happened is that there's been this not new arise, but this, I guess, specialist arise, where you have these firms that specialize in providing financing facilities to clubs, and that's their main speciality.
Right.
And so one example of this is 23 Capital, and essentially what they do is they specialize in providing development finance agreements or forward funding agreements to sporting organizations, given that the guaranteed future revenue streams is going to be secured. So the loan is going to be secured to the future revenue streams. And so you have firms like this uprising, and especially Macquarie Bank entering that league as well.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing all these firms popping up and providing this somewhat of a gap that's been vacant due to this rise of forward funding, and they're coming in and they're providing that service because traditional lenders are not able to, or they're not willing to like provide that service.
Right.
And I think, you know, over the coming years, it's something that will definitely be approached worldwide.
Yeah.
So, you know, maybe in the A-League, I'm not sure how the situation is in the A-League. Maybe there's completely different regulations.
Away. Yeah.
So it's something that will always merit consideration. I believe there's the benefits outweigh the disadvantages compared to traditional lending, and there's genuinely nothing wrong with it. Yeah,
brilliant.
Yeah,
there you go. So yeah, basically that was forward funding. If you want to read more about what forward funding is, etc., check it out on Ammaar's article that he's written. It goes into some real depth, and it's awesome. It just talks about, like, it really talks down what it involves with, and honestly, I'm not even smart enough to have a look at what this means. So yeah, definitely have a look at it. It's like I said, it's on our website. I don't have to say it again because I say it that many times. I've been told to stop saying soccernomics.net.
I go into like definitely much more financial detail when you look at the article.
Yeah.
So yeah, give it a if you enjoyed this, definitely give it a read.
Yeah. And
let us know how you felt about it.
We'll do. Also today, guys, if you did like today's video, leave us a like. We'd really appreciate the support. We're very, very close to hitting our next milestone on YouTube. So if you haven't already, guys, also hit the subscribe button. I'm going to leave our social media accounts in the link in the description as well, because we are trying to grow our presence on all platforms. We've actually just hit 1,000 followers on our Instagram page. Hey, massive.
Yes.
Massive. So thanks very much for all of you guys that are watching who have joined from Instagram. And Ammaar, also thank you very much for coming on today.
All good, man. I enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely enjoyed having you on here. And also next week we're going to be having Karim on, who is making his debut for Soccernomics.
Come on.
Yeah, he's
my guy.
Yeah, he's going to be talking about some excellent stuff. He's going to help us talk about what is going on with Barcelona. It sounds like a really, really broad subject, and you're probably sick of hearing about Barcelona, but we've taken a look at it from a different point of view. So stay tuned. But thanks very much for watching, guys, and we will catch you very, very soon.
See ya.